Welcome to the Sportsman's Voice podcast, your inside connection to outdoor legislation. From the Beltway to policy happening your way, we're covering it all. I'm your host, Fred Bird. Join us as we explore public land access, wildlife and fisheries management, Second Amendment rights, the triumphs that shape our nation, the sports we all love, and the stories that fuel our passion for the great outdoors. This is the Sportsman's Voice podcast. Welcome in, everybody, to another feature episode of the Sportsman's Voice podcast, the official podcast, Congressional Sportsman's Foundation. This week, we welcome in Congressman Garret Graves, Fisheries Policy Director for CSF, Chris Horton, and we're covering Rigs-To-Reef. If you've not heard about this from this program or anywhere else, sit back, relax. This is a fascinating conversation and topic. Short episode this week. So not a whole lot of your time, but a lot of important information in this one. And I'll say it again in the out. I just want to thank the congressman for his time. So very busy this year in an election year and trying to move legislation in a very congested hill. So at any rate, let's get into it. Congressman Graves, Chris Horton, let's go. All right, looks like we're greenlit everywhere. Thank you again, sir, for taking the time. I'm Fred Bird, work up here in the northeastern states based out of New Hampshire. And it's going to be a lot of fun. Certainly out of my depths with both of you folks, watermen. I'm just a lowly turkey hunter up here and a very poor fisherman, but I am known to catch a sunfish or two. I will tell you, my first red.
It leaves more for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. My first red was about as big as my computer screen, and I was tickled to death because it took me 3 trips down to South Carolina to make that happen. So
you're in the wrong state.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna pick that this fall, as I understand it. So I'm looking forward to getting down to your state there in Louisiana. Okay. With that, little banter out of the way. Welcome in. Congressman Garret Graves of Louisiana, the sportsman's paradise, as we were just kind of opining about. The congressman is a Congressional Sportsman's Caucus member and serves on the House Natural Resources Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing great, and thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be with you.
We're thrilled to have you. Also joining us, CSF's Director of Fisheries Policy, Chris Horton, one of the smartest fellows in the industry on such topics. We're also happy to have you. Chris, how are you?
Hey, Fred, thanks so much, and glad I had the opportunity to join y'all.
Yeah, this is great. We're going to get into a little bit of Rigs-To-Reef, which this audience has heard as we go back to NASC in a conversation Chris, myself, and ASA's Mike Leonard had. But then we're going to talk to the congressman. He has a bill that speaks to that program. But before we get going, while we were off air and I wanted to bring it on for the audience, you were both talking about upcoming fishing trips. You are home, sir. Doesn't sound like you're going to be able to get a line wet, but maybe so.
Yeah. So I've failed this week. I have. I really love to get on the water. We were able to open the season on April 15th, given something positive to tax day first time ever, which is really exciting, but unfortunately haven't been able to make it out of the water, but do have a trip planned a little bit later on this summer. And I'm sure as things often go, we'll end up getting out there on the water a good bit. Usually it's just kind of the last minute ones that are the most successful.
Yeah, for sure. Is it fair to ask, both of you can answer this, one species over another? Is there one that just really gets you going to get out on the water for?
I'll let the congressman answer first, but
no, please go ahead.
For me, honestly, that's been the appeal. Somebody that grew up freshwater fishing, the appeal of saltwater fishing is there's just so many species to catch out there. And yes, while red snapper may be our target, kind of our bread and butter, because they are so good to eat and we have so many of them, but it quickly transitions because it's easy to catch your limit on those, and then just to go fish for anything else, cobia, kingfish, mangrove snapper, there's just so many things to catch, and you never know what you're going to catch, especially when you're fishing around some of these structures we're going to talk about today.
Awesome.
Yeah, Fred, I have to agree with Chris. Red snapper, especially with all the blood, sweat, and tears we put into the appropriate access and management of the fishery over the last several years. That one is certainly the iconic fishery. I mean, just a good, fun fish to catch. Really, really good to eat, and of course, in abundance in the Gulf of Mexico. But the greatest thing about the Gulf is you can be in one spot and you reel up a grouper, you reel up a red snapper, you reel up a Spanish, you reel up or you'll chase after some cobia. I mean, it is this buffet, and there's no place like it. Amazing fish, so much fun. Heck, tuna, really just have a ball. But I do think that the red snapper are often the driving force for a lot of these trips and the inspiration for us to get out there on weekends.
Fantastic. And that probably speaks to part of your motivation for being on the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus, the CSC. Do talk to us a bit, sir. After you shortly arrived in Congress and you've risen to the rank of CSC vice chair, why is being a part of the CSC so important to you?
Well, look, first of all, I have to give a huge shout out to some of the co-chairs, Bruce Westerman from Arkansas and Jimmy Panetta from California. I mean, their leadership in maintaining this great organization. I can't say enough good about how great they have been to work with and just maintaining this very robust caucus in the Congress. But here's the thing: as to the why. So look, I'm from South Louisiana, and as much as I'd love to have mountains to go climb and ski on and everything else, our outdoors, our recreation is getting out of the water and going fishing. It is getting out in the blinds and going hunting. And that's what our outdoor recreation is here. I understand it is different than a lot of other states, but look, from a young kid, that's what we did. It's part of our culture. And we have some of the best restaurants in the country, and it just all comes from this bounty of the Gulf of Mexico and some of the lands we have in our state. And so joining the Congressional Sportsman's Caucus and being involved with the foundation for us is really just, it is the bread and butter. It is this fundamental thing that we grew up doing. It's part of our culture. It's part of our upbringing. And it's certainly something we want to make sure that we do right, we teach right, and that we maintain for generations to come.
That's fantastic. So with that in your leadership, you have a bill that we're going to get into, but I wanted to first start with Chris talking about Rigs-To-Reef and then we'll get into how your bill supports that program. Chris, touch on, for the benefit of the new audience, I know we talked about it back last December, but give us the high points, and then we'll let the congressman talk about his legislation.
Sure. Thanks, Fred. Well, I believe it was 84, the National Fisheries Enhancement Act was passed, which basically set the stage for a national artificial reef plan that allowed for a program called Rigs-To-Reef to be developed. And it's basically an administrative program right now with the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. But this program allows for offshore oil and gas platforms that are at the end of their life to have an opportunity, if the producer so chooses and the state wants that platform, there is a mechanism in place to be able to transfer the ownership of that platform to the states in order to keep that artificial habitat out there. And so the state assumes liability for it, for the structure itself. And sometimes it has to be towed to a reefing location, which is sometimes a challenge and a hurdle for being able to keep these structures out there. But ultimately, it's a great program. There's been several hundred platforms converted to artificial reefs, and Louisiana has the highest number because they have the highest number of platforms off their shore. But it's a wonderful program. But like anything else, there are opportunities to significantly improve it, and that's what the Congressman bill tries to do. And so I'll let him tell you a little bit more about it.
Congressman, please.
Yeah. So, look, the coast of Louisiana, or off the coast of Louisiana, is the most profound offshore energy area in the United States by far. And so what that really means is that there is an extraordinary amount of energy infrastructure in the Gulf of Mexico. And what we've seen since 2000 is that 60% of that energy infrastructure, those rigs have been removed. And this is the habitat. And in fact, depending on the species in the area, the areas around these rigs, you have 20 to 50 times the fish density there than you do in open water. So this is the habitat. And the irony is that we see these extraordinary mitigation measures that are often imposed on folks that are trying to build things in nearshore or in offshore waters. Yet you've developed these very robust, very abundant, very productive habitat areas associated with the energy infrastructure. And one agency saying you got to rip it all out without thinking about the importance of that habitat, the abundance of the fishery, of the biomass that's there. And so what this does is it really tries to strike that balance, and it tries to recognize how important this infrastructure, this energy infrastructure, is to fish abundance. And so what the bill does is instead of basically making the only option that's really incentivized is to come in and just remove the infrastructure. And as I said earlier, 60% of all of this rig infrastructure has been pulled out in just the last 23 years. And keep in mind, this stuff started in the 1940s. And so it's been there a long time. I mean, this rate of elimination is off the charts. And so what this does is our bill brings in the balance. Let's think about the ecological productivity. Let's think about the habitat that this provides and start measuring that, recognizing it provides huge fisheries benefits, and that we sort of incentivize or at least provide more of a balance for reefing those structures as opposed to just removing them. And one other thing on the irony side is we've seen in many cases where they would cut down this infrastructure in Louisiana, tow it over to another state and use it for reef habitat there. It's like, why are we just keeping it here? So look, good news is we have bipartisan support, which in this volatile, divisive Congress is really a rarity. And I want to thank Congressman Mark Vesey for working with us on this. And we had a hearing on the bill and even heard some, I think, likely positive comments from both sides of the aisle, which was really encouraging. And I'm looking forward to working with y'all and many others and ultimately getting this across the goal line.
Yeah, for sure. Chris, did you have any comment on that?
No, we just can't, as a recreational angler in the Gulf myself, I can't thank the congressman enough for taking on this challenge because, like he says, we're losing these things at an accelerated rate. And this bill doesn't do anything to that would minimize at all the procedure for making sure that the wells are secure, just like they would be if they had to be removed ashore. But what it does do is really try to facilitate keeping more of these out there, because one of the challenges, as I mentioned earlier too, is having to tow these things a long distance to an established reef area. It is just not feasible to do in a lot of cases. And so this bill would, if there's an established reef fish community found around these things, basically make the area that's been there for 40 years, 50 years, right around these platforms as reef planting areas so that they could be reefed in place, which is so important because that way we don't even have to disturb the community that's already there by towing it somewhere else. We can reef them right there in place, which is, I think, a huge incentive. It's a huge benefit to the marine environment not to have to disturb these things too much.
Look, Fred, the truth is I'm a horrible fisherman and need all the help I can get.
Sounds like me. It sounds like I need to come to Louisiana.
Well, when you go fishing around oil and gas platforms off Louisiana or anywhere in the Gulf Coast, it's no longer fishing, it's catching. You're going to catch something.
Yeah. Indeed. So in a recent letter of support, led by CSF along with other recreational fishing organizations, we addressed how the development of offshore oil and gas infrastructure has been enhancing the marine habits and the coastal waters, as you said, sir, since the 1940s. What benefits these structures on the outer continental shelf provide recreational anglers like yourself, divers, and commercial fishermen alike? And we started touching on it here in the last bit, but if you could kind of dive in a little bit, no pun intended.
So look, off the coast of Louisiana, with rare exception, we don't really have natural reefs and things like that. There's one area over on the southwest coast, but otherwise we don't. We largely have open water. We have a very muddy and sandy bottom, and so what this energy infrastructure brings to the table is it brings reef structure, and it is remarkable how quickly, after this stuff is installed, how quickly it establishes at a very, very healthy reef environment, very, very abundant fisheries. And of course, Chris is the guru on this, but it provides, kind of the, um, I guess the congregation, sort of the location. It provides the protection, it provides the habitat for different species, and it is remarkable starting at the top of the water column and working your way down and just seeing the abundance grow. Um, and so, I'm just going to say this again. What it does is it takes otherwise what they largely refer to as uncharacterized water bottoms and just this open, sandy, muddy water bottom, and it brings diversity. It brings reef structure to it, which is just amazing habitat that, as I noted, the aggregation of fish is off the charts with 20 to 50 times that compared to open water bottoms.
Yeah, the congressman's absolutely right. I think the estimate is somewhere between 96 and 98% of the substrate in the Gulf of Mexico is just sand and mud. So there's nothing hard for organisms like barnacles to attach to and to be able to start pulling nutrients from the water column that would otherwise drift out. So once you have that hard structure in place, these organisms can start building a reef ecosystem and pulling organic matter out of the water column and actually contributing to biomass.
Right.
For a long time, NOAA said, well, they're just aggregators. They're not fish producers. But recent science has really dispelled that tremendously, that we have to have that hard substrate to get these primary producers, or these organisms that feed off the primary producers, to be able to start assimilating that biomass there. So there is no question that, in my mind, that the oil and gas platforms in the Gulf of Mexico have significantly contributed to increasing the overall biomass of fish in the Gulf. And that's why they're so important. It's so necessary to try to stem the loss of these things.
Yeah, for sure. And kind of going back in time with the conversation you and I had, and myself coming up to speed on this program and learning, it struck me, like getting smacked in the face with irony that the people that want to remove these structures are the same people that will go somewhere else and advocate for marine life. And we got to save the whales and the porpoises. And that's all good. We get down with that too. But you're literally destroying an entire habitat on what was otherwise useless mud. I mean, I'm sure there's some microcosmic, subterranean critters in there, but for all intents and purposes, it's created this amazing habitat with amazing fish that goes, like you got both at different levels as you get through the water column, supporting all this robust life and creating opportunities for outdoor recreational fishing, diving, and even a commercial fishery. Now we have an economy set up around this. And for me, I still just talking about it, I don't understand how someone thinks that's a bad thing and wants to get rid of these structures. It makes no sense.
Well, Fred, if I can jump in on that, what
Please.
we've seen, I think in many cases, is there's just this bias because it is energy infrastructure, and so there's this bias or candidly, I guess, this prejudice that anything associated with energy is bad, and so we've got to pull it out. It's wreaking havoc, and the truth is, and this is increasingly becoming clear, is that it's actually providing benefit. And so, I think it's just getting folks to kind of, press pause on that impulse and that immediate response and reaction and say, hey, let's take a minute to actually look at the science here and make sure that we're making an informed decision, not an emotional decision to what the right thing to do is.
We do have this like automatic reaction. All of us, I mean, whatever side you're on or you pick, whatever your philosophies are, we have a bias built into us. And it is funny how, like you just said, with this one, they automatically, it's energy, it equals bad. And I think what's great about our organization, what's great about the hunting and fishing community is that, and it's even said in our caucus, it's nonpartisan, it's bipartisan. Like this lifestyle does not require an RDIL, whatever you want to put in front of your name. That stuff literally does not matter. And this is a perfect example of that, not falling into that trap, that default trap of just submitting to some dogma that you're so committed to. It just doesn't have a place.
That's absolutely right. I think it's just a matter of education. The folks just really don't realize the intrinsic value of this. Matter of fact, there was a study done on the corals found on these platforms in the northern Gulf of Mexico, and the conclusion by the scientists that did the study was, he said that these structures have intrinsic environmental value because they found a couple of species of coral that are in high abundance on these platforms in the northern Gulf that are actually endangered in the rest of the world, listed on the IUCN globally critically endangered list, but they're thriving in the northern Gulf. And so their conclusion was these things have tremendous environmental value, but people just don't know that because of that initial reaction. Well, it has to do with oil and gas. It must be. It's not.
No. Well, silver lining is about, and I wouldn't even call it a lining. Like it's right there in your face, and obviously all of us working together do a good job, or attempt to do a good job of educating as many people willing to listen without their bias on. So with these rigs in place, I know some of them get cut down. Chris, you and I have talked about that, but what are some of the more common practices of converting oil and gas structures into reefs after you decommission them? Are they toppling in place, partial remover? What's the preferred or common method?
Well, it really depends on the scenario, and you've got to take a number of factors into consideration. Number one is you have to think about, is there navigation in this area? Are there ports nearby? And thinking about the depth or the draft that you're going to want to ensure you're maintaining safe navigation. So that's one thing to consider on that kind of safety side. But then on the other side, and certainly where Chris is the expert, is that the higher in the water column your structure is, the greater the biomass, the greater the abundance, the more diversity in habitat. And so ideally, you actually leave as much of the structure in the water column as you can. But of course, I'll say it again, you've got to balance it with the safety. And then the other thing is it from an environmental perspective related to the energy resource, in some cases, and it really depends on your well scenario, it may make more sense to actually move the platform from above the well. And again, there are just some unique circumstances where that may take place. But those are generally the three considerations: kind of the navigation, safety that you need to be thinking about. How do you maintain as much of it in the water column as you can? And then what type of well and P&A, plugging and abandoning operations do you need on that wellhead to ensure that it is going to be permanently closed and not cause any problems over the long term? But I'm sure Chris probably has something to add and correct.
No, sir, you did a great job explaining that. I mean, some situations, the substrate itself is not stable enough to leave it standing and reef in place. So you do have to tow those. But ideally, as you highlighted, that vertical relief, as much of that vertical relief you can leave in the water column as possible, you benefit all kinds of both, not only benthic or reef fish species like snapper and grouper, but then you have, you're attracting bait fish, which are important to pelagic species, from yellowfin tuna to blue marlin. So there's plenty of science there, especially out of Hart Research Institute, that demonstrates the more that you can leave in the water column, the better it is for fish habitat, which is why the partial removal, as the Congressman was explaining, where you cut off the top at the highest with the least amount of clearances you can possibly get based on the shipping traffic, and just take that top section and set it down beside that structure. That is the least intrusive, it's the least disruptive to the overall marine ecosystem. And basically, you continue to proceed on. All of a sudden, we have this platform that's been serving as an artificial reef for 30 years can continue doing so well into the future in multiple generations.
And for the listening audience who's having a hard time picturing this, other than just a big platform sticking out of the ocean, for navigation, are they marked physically with buoys out there? Are they marked with GPS so that these shipping lanes are well marked and ships know how to navigate around them? How are people knowing these things are out there, and how deep?
Well, the short answer is yes, and so when these things are installed, they actually have a significant topside, so they are out of the water. Some cases hundreds of feet out of the water, depending on the size. So they have a significant visual presence. But when you start thinking about reefing, in some cases, depending upon proximity to navigation channel, there may be a push by the navigation community to say, all right, hey, let's go ahead and whack this thing off. Now, in some cases, again, depending on the conditions, you may go ahead and cut it below the water line, but then go ahead and put navigation lights in place just to make folks aware. And of course, all this would be mapped and things along those lines. But all of that is part of the reefing plan that you develop for that specific structure.
Very good. And again, for someone trying to find a reason to not like this, like we got back to, this, it's nice to know and hear that this is all part of the planning, and probably very elementary on your end, but for the general public trying to understand that, it's a big consideration and good to hear articulated.
Well, Fred, I think something that's important to note is that in terms of offshore energy production and this, big intense activity in the offshore areas, the only places where you really have any activity like this are Alaska, California, and then of course the four of the Gulf states: Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. That's it. So I understand how this could be foreign to a lot of folks, but certainly in the Gulf of Mexico, it is something that is well understood and often recognized. But for many of these other states, again, especially the inland states, I understand how this is Greek to a lot of folks. But we literally have hundreds of these structures reefed off the coast of Louisiana, and it's been wildly successful.
Yeah,
It's a fantastic point to bring up. Go ahead, Chris. I don't want to step on you.
Well, I think we're probably going to say the same thing, but the congressman brings up a great point, is that this needs to be relevant to everybody in the country because these belong to all of us. These are federal waters, and I've met so many people when finishing Venice, Louisiana, or Grand Isle, Louisiana, or Fort Morgan, Alabama, where I fish out of. I've met anglers that are fishing around our Rigs-To-Reefs from Michigan, from Alaska, from New York. I mean, these structures belong to all of us, and that's one of the challenges. We have to really elevate this as this is a national treasure that we have here that's worth protecting. And if you're an angler that from some of these northern states have never fished the Gulf of Mexico, it's got to be on your bucket list. And when you go, you're probably going to be fishing around an oil gas platform or a reef platform.
Yeah, so you hit it. That was part one of my follow-up. But the other part of that, to the congressman's comment, is it's important, I think, in our community to understand what works in your area doesn't work in others. And just because you don't know about it doesn't make it bad. I'm not going to presume that you understand moose populations in Louisiana as we do here in New England. Conversely, I'm not going to I shouldn't, and our community shouldn't try to impose an opinion against something that is so well understood where you live. And then we come together and I'll teach you about moose and tick, the depredation, and you can teach me more about red snapper around oil and gas rigs. And I think that's a beautiful thing about our community.
I'm confident we have one of our zoos.
I know you got a tiger somewhere for sure.
In the interest of time, I want to be respectful for everybody. So I think with this last question, Congressman, your bill seems to leave open the potential for pipelines and other OCS oil and gas infrastructure to be considered for inclusion in the state's Rigs-To-Reefs program. Why do you feel that this is important?
Fred, it's a great question. And you heard Chris talk twice about, kind of this emerging science. And as we learn more and as we study more, and that is the product of something that we learned recently in what was known as the Great Red Snapper Count. And this was this very, very robust activity to go out and evaluate the Gulf of Mexico and help get a better handle, a better assessment on the health of the red snapper stocks in the Gulf. And what they found is that what was referred to as uncharacterized water bottoms, that was actually areas where you had pipelines. So you didn't have this big, tall, robust energy infrastructure. You simply had a pipeline or pipeline crossings. That these areas, even with a simple infrastructure of just having a linear pipeline, that the abundance of fishery in those areas was dozens of times beyond what had ever been projected. And so this is, I'll say it again, it is an emerging issue where we are learning more about where we're having habitat, where there's fisheries abundance. And so we wanted to make sure that the bill recognized this information and allowed for, again, recognizing these areas that otherwise were believed to be void of fish that we found are actually very abundant habitat.
Yeah, the congressman's absolutely right. That was a real eye opener, I think, to a lot of scientists. And there's even been theories that, most of the red snapper biomass is in the Western Gulf, but how it's been able to repopulate so quickly in the Eastern Gulf. Some theories are that these pipelines acted as like highways because they like to orient the structure and they migrated along these pipelines. I know personally, I have places in Alabama that some of my best spots are on where pipelines intersect. There's usually a little junction box there. Most of the time, you can't even see it on the depth finder, on the chart plotter.
If you just put those GPS coordinates right up, that'd be great. Just show us where those are.
We might work out a trade, but for whatever reason, red snapper and triggerfish are often just stacked up on these things. Just this little bitty relief on the bottom. And in one of the other arguments about pipelines, I think they are incredibly important for fish and as a fish habitat. But the flip side of that is, okay, some people may think of, these just abandoned pipelines full of oil. No, they're not full of oil. They have to be cleaned and flushed with seawater. So it's basically just the metal. But another argument is that if you remove these things, you're doing more damage to the seafloor than you could ever have done just by leaving them out there. So it's another good reason if they're clean hydrocarbons and they're providing fish habitat, again, it's one of these head scratchers. Why would we require them to come out?
Yeah, for sure. It's a fascinating subject. And I again, coming away from this conversation, I'm just like you, I'm scratching my head, like how and why could you possibly see a negative to this? And that's what you guys are going to do. Continue to answer those questions with your leadership, Congressman, trying to make these things stay in place and for the benefit, to Chris's point, of everybody. Not just folks that are in the Gulf, but immediately affecting the Gulf citizens. So thank you for your leadership, sir. And thank you, most importantly, for your time. We really appreciate you coming on. And thank you, Chris, for joining us as well.
Yes, I can't express my gratitude enough to the congressman. I mean, he's truly been one of our biggest champions on fisheries management issues, not just in the Gulf, but around the country. And yeah, just really appreciate his participation on the Sportsman's Caucus. And he's our current vice chair in the House, and we're just thrilled to have him in that capacity.
Hey, Fred, thank you for hosting this. It's been great, and I do have to give a shout out to Chris. We certainly can draft legislation, but having folks that know the science and can help inform the right solutions like Chris, it makes it so much easier to do things like this. And just really appreciate the relationship we have with him and some of the other folks from the CSF.
That's awesome. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
So there it is. Short show, like I said, but packed full of great information. And if you've never heard of this stuff before, you got to come away thinking, how is this a bad thing? To Chris's point, normally when you hear gas and oil in the environment, people recoil. They have sometimes a visceral reaction, but the ecosystem that's been created here, and out of nothing, which is remarkable, right? Normally it's man-made structures, infrastructure is going to take away from the environment, is going to, degrade and just cause all sorts of habitat destruction. And in this case, it's 180 degrees the other way. And even, Chris cited some endangered, or he said endangered, but I think it was even higher level of endangered, like to the point that species of coral don't exist anywhere else in the world except for here on these structures. So not only they created amazing habitat, amazing fisheries, but also offering a home to species that are nowhere else in the world. That's remarkable. So again, I come away with, you got to leave them in place. You gotta make these things for what they are and just leave them alone. So much depends on it. We talked about the local economy, the ability for recreational fishing, commercial fishing. Chris said, it's a national treasure, and it belongs to all of us. These are federal waters. These structures are in, and these are opportunities for all of us to enjoy and go down there and visit these places and go fishing, go diving, go just check this stuff out. It's really remarkable. Anyway, probably said all that, and then I'm just being redundant, but it's, when you learn about it, I certainly become passionate about it and just don't want to see it go away. So with updates as we move forward, we will come back and update you and let you know how this stuff is moving forward. Again, big thank you to the congressman and his work on this and his leadership within the caucus, within the committee. It's just, it's always good to have folks as passionate as we are on our side. It's great. And Chris, as always, thank you for your intelligence, your deep knowledge of this stuff, and being able to share it with the audience and everybody else. So that's the show. If you've hung on this long, housekeeping, NAS Summit is open for early bird registration. Make sure you get in on that. If you're coming, do check out the weekly TSB Roundup, our weekly newscast from stories all around the country and what's going on. Way to stay up to date on that. Like, subscribe, rate. Say it every week. And as we get closer to this election, vote. Make sure you're going. Make sure you're taking a friend. We're going to keep harping on this to November 5th and beyond. 20% of licensed hunters are showing up, and the rest aren't. That's a terrible, abysmal number. It's it can be better. So anyway, that's the show. Thanks so much for bringing us along wherever you're at. Until the next show, we will see you later. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us on this edition of the Sportsman's Voice podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, your support is crucial, and you can help us out right now by leaving a review, filling in those 5 stars where available, sharing this episode with friends and family, and engaging with us socially. CSF can be found on Facebook, Instagram, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Together, we can protect the outdoor sports we love and continue to keep you informed wherever you are. That's it for this week. Until next time, we'll see you later.